questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not really a question, but more of a statement, I guess. I think Blizzard was really shrewd to borrow a lot from Games Workshop in terms of art direction.
Yeah.
Because when you're looking at the readability, especially when you're talking like esports, to be able to see an army, recognize silhouettes, and then they had similar exaggerations with like the giant pauldrons and big hands and big weapons of like the Space Marines, where you could like instantly tell and the important features come to light immediately. Whereas like you play a game like this, the graphics are an initial draw maybe, but they quickly become abstract when you play it enough. You're not thinking about like, you know, the way the mech warrior kind of thing turns its upper body, or like that doesn't even, you know, enter in your sort of visual analysis anymore. You're just thinking in terms of symbols.
Yeah, I think like one of the things is like, I don't know how much can be kind of like attributed to just like brilliance and good design, but they were already like establishing like a cohesive Blizzard style even by Warcraft 2, right? When Diablo came out, like that was another studio that was kind of in partnership and then got rolled into Blizzard, and like they're like friends and stuff. So like Diablo kind of broke from the pattern a little bit, but like Warcraft and StarCraft, like you said, they like borrowed heavily from Games Workshop, and you know, like they kind of figured out the legibility problem like really early.
Well,
and
Diablo, you're center viewed, right, on your character, so it's like more of a. It doesn't have to be as symbolic quite. You're not dealing with an army. You're not dealing with reading things. You have a player character, and it's always going to be in the center of the camera. So it's sort of a different set of goals that they had for that art direction, which.
Yeah, but that's not even like a given either, right? Because if you play Diablo 3, like visually it's utter nonsense, right? Like that's why they have like circles all over the place to kind of help visually identify where things are. It's just like lightning and fire and body parts, and like, so like the camera perspective like helped, but it's not something that you can't mess up.
I'd be curious to see that screenshot of the original.
Let me see if I can Google it real quick.
The original art direction.
It's oh man, super great. It's like,
I think it was like less, because it was we went a pre-rendered route, and so back then it was the Warcraft 2 route was more like hand drawn.
Yeah.
So they did, it was like a hand drawn take on the same art, like concept art that they used for the pre-rendered stuff. So I think it was just like a little bit dated maybe.
Oh, here it is. Oh man, it's so great. It's like, it's super good. People are like, oh, it's like orcs in space.
Yeah, but that looks like Kind of Darkness, like.
Yeah, but I mean, like, keep in mind, right? Like when Warcraft 1 launched, right, and like you kind of like keep clicking on like the peon, and it starts like sassing you, right? Like Blizzard like had this like really high bar that they had to meet. Everyone had like really high expectations for StarCraft, and so like you just got done with Warcraft 2 and the expansion, and then like, you know, like Diablo's come out, and you're like, oh, Blizzard's like just firing on all cylinders, and you go to E3 and they're like, oh, they're gonna show StarCraft, and then like you see that and you're like, oh man, like it's not what I was hoping for. Yeah, and then they like, you know, fixed it obviously, but yeah, like this is how it started.
So RTS is not my genre, but to me one of the most interesting moments is when you fully explain that going up the hill charge. So what I was thinking about is like the other big esports moment that I always think about is like the Street Fighter 3 parry moment, where the guy like parries a million hits on his last hit and then re-wins the match. And then to see like, oh, that whole audience knows what just happened in that moment on a way more complicated game than two people fighting. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, two people fighting, one wins. But it's like that whole audience knew the rules of that game. That to me the most fascinating thing about the esports, like, that they could communicate that to an audience.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of just like raw exposure, right? Like you could be the worst StarCraft friend, right? But you know like what your good StarCraft friends are doing, which is kind of a testament to the watchability. Like I watch like StarCraft replays and stuff like that of like the championship matches and stuff like that. Part of it is just like the natural design of the game and like, you know, all the stuff that was designed into it to make it like legible. But the other thing is like the whole casting culture. All the kind of like commentators that were kind of like explaining what's happening in the game was a huge part of it. You had experts kind of telling the audience like, oh my god, this is about to happen. If they do this perfectly, they might make it up the ramp. And then you're like, oh, are they going to make it up the ramp? Right? So they were able to prime people. And so like quickly they like put the competitors in these soundproof booths facing in a direction where they couldn't see the jumbo screen with like these visual blinders so they couldn't see when people started cheering and losing their mind in case it like tipped them off. But I'm pretty sure they could hear like the whole thing's like shaking and stuff like that.
Yeah, so to sort of add to that, and I told you a little bit of this story, but I went to Korea in 2004, and I was really blown away. Like, I'm not somebody that's like super into sports, but a lot of my high school friends just like love sports, so I've seen a bunch of ESPN. And like in Korea in 2004, it was like 2.5 basically dedicated channels to StarCraft. And it was like ESPN 1, ESPN 2, and ESPN 3. So that third channel also did Warcraft 3, and they did StarCraft. There was like 1/3 of StarCraft, and then the other 2 were full-time StarCraft. And it's like you have like your 4 to 6 announcers going off in Korean very excitedly, and then the people that play, they stand up, they kind of walk in with like, it's almost like NASCAR, like leather with like emblems and logos of like all their sponsors, and they come in with their own mouse and keyboard, plug in, and then they play, and then everybody's like screaming and everybody. And I mean, I understood it, but I couldn't understand.
It's like the WWE entrance, right? Yeah. Like you know, like they got the music pumping, and then like people have like sparklers and stuff.
Yeah.
It was like,
I want to just like Pepsi and like Xbox and like. I want to say Pennzoil, but that's but stuff like that, just like all over badges.
Yeah, it was like one of the things that I thought was like really kind of like interesting about that period is that like one of the things that we didn't talk about at all was like the drama of the competition, right? There were like really tremendous players whose like videos are still up and you can kind of like look at them. And there was a period of time where like StarCraft was the esport. There's like nobody else on the market. So all of Korea was super invested. And like part of what made it possible for like us on the Western Hemisphere to kind of be able to partake in all this stuff is you had American StarCraft players like go to Korea and like start to train and like learn the language. And one person that was like a really big sort of like StarCraft personality for a while, Day 9, his brother was also a competitor, Tasteless, and his buddy Artosis like went over to Korea to compete, and they like stayed over there and trained in these houses playing like hours and hours of StarCraft. And like at some point they like transitioned to being like casters, right? And what I'd heard was like somebody wasn't there, and so they like went to Tasteless and they're like, it's like, can you do this? And then he's like, well, I've been eliminated, so like I guess I've got some time now. And so he started doing it, and like he was pretty good. Like I really like both Tasteless and Artosis. And so it was like when they started like really casting it that like all of these later StarCraft and Brood War matches and StarCraft 2 matches became like something that we could kind of like follow along with, which spawned all these other people like Loco and all these other casters. But there was a period of time where like you needed Korean or subtitles to be able to like understand why like people are losing their minds. Yes.
Do you have a sense of like what percentage of the competitiveness and the unpredictability and the skill-based aspect was stuff Blizzard designed, and what was exploits they didn't see coming, except like six pooling? Because like did they try to make a Command and Conquer-esque game where everyone has a good time and it was accidentally really skill-based and competitive?
I mean, listening to Blizzard talk about their design process, like clearly they were already headed very much in the right direction. I don't think they saw how high the ceiling was, but I think they were moving in that space. The fact that they went with like the 3 different races and they made sure that each unit was like very distinct and all this other stuff, like clearly there was like something in their bones that was taking them in that direction.
Sure.
In terms of like how much, like what percentage, like it's kind of hard to say, but I can say that like when we were playing without knowledge of what was happening in the competitive space in Korea, we're real bad, like embarrassingly bad, and it was still fun, right? Like the game was good. like we would kind of like turtle in our bases that we'd modified to have like endless minerals, and then we'd like never leave until we had like a maxed out army of like siege tanks or carriers, and then like we all went to the middle of the map and watched everything explode. That was high school StarCraft for like me and my friends. But like even that was good, right? So like clearly they understood that like if you make it fun for terrible people, and like assume that like masterful players will eventually get good enough, I think they understood that, but I don't think they realized how far people could take it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So, on the competitive level, how much has this game been patched? Because
oh my god, the patch notes is like it's like pages and pages and pages, right?
Yeah, because I was thinking about that. I was like, it's like okay, they have this game that's so like almost perfectly formed, and people are developing all these strategies, but it's like, how much is the developer then stepping in and being like, oh, do we need to rebalance this game? You know?
Yeah, I think like with StarCraft and Brood War, I'd have to double check this, but my experience with those patches were they're like, this is too fast, and then they'd kind of like adjust stuff. By StarCraft 2, they wanted this sort of seasonality. So when StarCraft Wings of Liberty launched, StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty launched, they had a sort of like setup, and then with each subsequent expansion, they introduced some more units, and so that kind of changed the meta and all this other stuff. And now that they've released their last expansion, what they do is like on an annual cycle, when a competitive series ends, they do a massive rebalance. Oh. And so each year when you watch StarCraft 2 competitions, like the first thing you do is like watch what happens after the competitions and all the kind of like pros playing other pros, figuring out the new balance and the new meta. And then some stuff starts to work, and then people start developing answers, and then like you follow this entire drama right up until competitive season, and then you're like, I've been seeing him use a lot of siege tanks, let's see if he goes for siege tanks. And so there's this kind of like nice seasonal sort of patching approach now with StarCraft 2, which kind of like gives some like longevity to the game.
But like is StarCraft 1 like a game that is now set in stone, or does that even still get patched?
I don't know. So like Blizzard released the StarCraft remaster, and I think since that's finding a new competitive following, they're probably going to like if that gets as big, I'm sure they'll dedicate enough people to do the seasonal patching.
Actually, they promised to never patch the first one.
Oh,
Hasn't
really?
had a patch in 19 years. The first one was making the pool cost 50 more gas, 50 more coal or minerals.
So there you go.
There's like the patches at this point are like graphic glitches and stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
There is one where like the loading screen was all like inverted and they fixed it, but it took them like 20 years. So like things like that, they do.
So that could still, in theory, kill some kind of exploit. Right?
No,
like
they accidentally fixed a Valkyrie bug and reintroduced it.
Yeah.
Because they promised to not.
That rules.
Yeah.
Yes, hand in the back.
So I don't have most of this information on the top of my head at this point, but it's worth looking up. StarCraft is heavily used in AI development.
Yeah.
Recently. Platform. A lot of the AI that you think is in StarCraft is actually not really there. There's a lot of script-driven stuff where it's like, will surprise you if you're playing against a computer. It knows where your characters are and like can spawn events. And so a lot of what you think is intelligent is actually like pre-canned scripts playing out. But there's been a long history of AI researchers trying to play like a person.
Yeah.
For the last, and there's plenty of papers on it. There's I just found a YouTube video of the history of it.
Yeah, it's only a few weeks old, right? Like they had 2 pro players play against this AI that played training sets against itself. So like when they beat the world's best Go player, who's Korean, the next sort of step was Dota or League of Legends. Dota. And then they had it just play training sets against itself. And then with StarCraft they did the same thing. And if you haven't, watch a a version of those matches with a commentator, because some of the stuff that it's doing, it's like, why is it doing this? It's like super suboptimal, and then it does other things that it's like brilliant. Not cheating, right? Like they capped the APM, they made sure that the camera had to be on a screen for it to have information to go through its decision tree and all this other stuff. But at the same time, it's kind of cheating. Like they're like, oh, average 300 APM, which is like what, like entry-level pro player kind of does. But then it spikes to like 1,000. It's like, oh, okay. Like, must be super tough to like do perfect control when you can do like, twice like what the best player does. But yeah, like even then, there's like certain things where like, without getting like super into it, there's like one particular type of unit, and it only played Protoss versus Protoss matchups. And I think the two pro players, neither of them played Protoss, so that's like, fine. But even in those matchups, these pro players, like when you're a pro player, you know the other races inside out, and they're like no slouches, right? And watching those games, like you get to see, like I guess when it played against itself, like there's like different versions of this AI. So it, like one AI plays a certain way, another AI plays another certain way, and they kind of like cycled through the different AIs to play against the players. I guess one of them just kind of kept getting punked with cheeses. And so it did all this stuff, like defensively. It's like, oh, they might be hiding over here. And then there's just like a probe making sure that it's not getting like offensive towered and stuff like that. Where like, it's like, I don't know why you're so scared, but it totally was. And then another one's like super aggressive. It's like, oh yeah, this is the way to win. I'm just going to come at you right from the first like seconds. And it's like, it's really interesting to see what a machine that had only played itself, how it thinks of the game. It's really interesting. Any other questions?
So an alternative universe with no StarCraft, was there another game people were playing a lot in South Korea at this time?
So like this also kind of like marked the period of like some internal game development in Korea. So the first kind of big game was Lineage, which was a MMO. It was super grindy, but it was designed for a Korean kind of like space, right? In Korea, you were going with all of your friends coming probably out of the same school and the same hagwons, like your X number of friends. You'd all go to the same PC bang, and then you'd all load up Lineage. So when you're hanging out with your friends and you're like grinding the same mob to get the +1 sort of the whatever, like that wasn't really like a big deal. And then if like your group of friends made friends with like another group of friends, then all of a sudden you had a clan and you can take a castle. And that made sense in Korea, and then they released Lineage 2 in the US, and like everyone's like, I don't have this many friends. Like, this does not work for me. But there's a lot of stuff as a consequence of PC bangs that like started this trajectory of internal Korean game design and development. But now a lot of PC bangs are failing because of like regulations and a shift in the climate. A lot of people just own laptops, right? So like there's personal computers, so there's less reason to go to like PC bangs and stuff like that. So Korea is like, it's not this kind of like static space like, oh, PC bangs, that's what we do now, and like that's all it is. Since then, it's like dramatically changed, and there's a whole discussion to be had about like Blizzard and StarCraft 2 and Kespa and what happened and why like StarCraft 2 didn't become the esports successor, and there's a lot of internal politics and money and posturing and all this other stuff. But Korean game design, up until that sort of era, and like a lot of the MMOs were kind of designed around the expectation that you're playing with a lot of friends in the same PC bang in your neighborhood. Yeah, please.
Oh, hey. I was wondering if you had any thoughts of, I know like I was playing StarCraft Brood War right before StarCraft 2 was released, and then I played a little bit of StarCraft 2, and I was like, oh, this is a little stupid or something. I've heard that like the Blizzard's regulations have kind of like affected the scene and kind of killed and altered it in certain ways, and I was wondering what were your thoughts on that, or
like StarCraft 2?
Yeah, and like how it's affected stuff like that.
Yeah, so like Blizzard missed out on all that money, right? Like they had no part of Korea's like competitive StarCraft scene. The only money they made were from sales of the game, right? But there's like so much more money, like an unbelievable amount of money. So they wanted a piece of that pie, right? And so when they designed StarCraft 2, they designed it to be an esport. And so what they started doing was talking about how they wanted to have control over the broadcasting rights of esports competitions that were being held even in Korea. And they said that it's our property, it's being played exclusively on multiplayer, it's reliant on our services, we want to do this. Kespa was like, it's like, nah, like that's not how we want to do it. And Blizzard's like, yeah, but like you want to have another esport, and we're making StarCraft 2 and everyone's like super hyped about it. And they're like, It's like, yeah, but no, like I don't wanna. And so Blizzard like tried to call their bluff, and they're like, we're gonna release the game, and we are going to negotiate all these broadcasting rights and all this other stuff. And Kespa's like, all right, we're gonna make it a mature game so that it can't be broadcast on television. And so basically all these people that were getting ready to transition to StarCraft 2 basically were competing in a game that could not be televised in Korea. And so like both sides sort of capitulated and kind of like they softened their stance and all this other stuff. But it kind of really kind of comes down to the money of it. And what ultimately ended up falling out was that like StarCraft 2 had a weak enough start that it never really kind of gained the same traction. So a lot of strong players stayed in Brood War and never went over to StarCraft 2. And then League of Legends and Dota 2 also started happening. CSGO started getting big. And so they lost their shot. And so Blizzard tried to kind of scramble and kind of get back on it. But it was like that ship had already sailed. But that's not really like Blizzard's fault, right? Like it's their game and like they wanted a piece of the action. I think they probably overestimated their clout in a space that like really they were like when they first came to Korea, they were like heroes, like thanks for making the most awesome thing that has ever happened, right? And then they kind of like started doing this stuff and people were like, oh man, you just want money, right? And it really kind of like ruined their image a little bit. And as a consequence, like I don't think they understood how deeply ingrained Kespa and like the government and these like broadcasting agencies and the chebos and all of them like how close they were and how like not like in the cool kids group Blizzard was, and they just could not throw their weight around the same way. I think now actually StarCraft 2 is like super watchable, and I think it's really good. It doesn't have the same player base, doesn't have the same prize pool, but I still think like StarCraft 2 is like a really great game to watch. Like there's a lot of like new and emerging drama as like new like really great players are kind of coming onto the scene, and like for the first time we saw like Western players beat Koreans. Also like this is kind of cool, like in StarCraft like Western players call Western players foreigners because it's so in the like Korean mindset. And so when they talk about Scarlet, who's also known as the Queen of Blades in reference to Kerrigan, she is a massively successful foreign player playing in Korea, and it's like it always kind of like rung wrong in my ear at first. Like you have like a lot of like American people speaking American English, and it's like, oh, this foreign player is blah 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 blah, and then like you see just like a field of Korean faces, and then like not talking about them, and it's a very sort of interesting inversion. But you actually see Europe and Canada, and there was a period of time where there's like some Americans that were competitive, and so you see that sort of space opening up a little bit, and I think it's still super watchable. I really enjoy it. Any other questions?
I was just going to say, one of the things, we were talking about AI earlier, and one of the things that I really liked about the first StarCraft is, this is like before Super Meat Boy showed you all your failures in this episode. Like you could rewatch a game that you played online or with your friends, and you could even speed it up, and without the fog of war you could see what everybody was doing the whole time. So even when you were losing, you could still see what the winning strategy was for that particular game. And I think that helped build in your own like personal AI like skill levels. Be like, oh, I should have done this instead of this. Oh, that was really smart what this person did. And you can kind of learn from all your opponents, like the more often you play.
Yeah, I think Blizzard really did a tremendous job of trying to make StarCraft 2 more accessible. One of the things that StarCraft 2 did was, I think they tried to simplify the game so that it was easier to understand, and as a consequence, like you had hard counters, right? And so that meant you just had to know more information, and if you made a mistake, it got punished super, super hard really fast. And so what that did was like, even though they had all of the replay stuff and like the kind of like introduction to different units so you can kind of familiarize yourself with the game. I don't know if you saw me playing earlier, I'm a little rusty, but then like I didn't look at my base for what felt like a second, and then I had 5,000 minerals, and then that sort of like lapsed, like a bunch of stuff died, right? And that's kind of like what StarCraft 2 feels like now, is like you have to care about so many more things all over the map, and it's actually more intense. So despite all the hand-holding and trying to make the game simpler and more approachable, it's kind of harder, and it punishes inattention in a way that like I think makes it feel like an altogether different game than Brood War. right? Like Brood War was, you know, like you had like single unit armies, right? And if you just got really good with Marines and you had like one science vessel and like a dropship, right? Like you could be like super competitive, right? Or you're like the Muta master, right? Like you have all these Mutalisks and like that's what you make, right? You have some Zerglings for defense or whatever, and then like you're doing all this like impossible stuff. But now like you have to have like a balanced unit composition, and like you have to expand within the first couple of minutes or else you're going to fall behind, and there's just the expectation is higher, and all the rungs that they built for players to kind of climb this like ladder, insufficient, right? Like it gets you to the top of a plateau that is at the bottom of the pewter league. Like, you just cannot compete with all the kind of like hand-holding they do for you. Like, you lose real bad and it feels real bad.
Thanks.
Yeah? All right,
Thank you so much.